Great. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this distinguished speaker series and this presentation by Imran Abdool. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Napawac, and Chinookton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. And please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And now it is a pleasure to introduce Imran Abdool. Imran is the Group President of Blue Crystal Technologies and Business Insights. In Canada, he's previously lectured in economics and finance at the University of Windsor, Western Ontario, and McMaster Universities. He's a former instructor as well at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth in Baltimore, Maryland. Imran is a past member of the Assistant Deputy Minister's Office for Financial Sector Policy for Canada at the Department of Finance, Canada. So maybe you have an in for internships for us. His commentary on economic and financial matters has appeared numerous times in the national media, including the Globe and Mail, CBC National News, and the Toronto Star. I think I saw recently the one on healthcare
Globe and Mail, yeah.
in the Globe and Mail.
Yeah.
And today, Imran will be talking about a decade as a consulting economist from municipalities to banking.
Thank you very much,
Welcome.
Vicki. And I'll tell the story at the end of the talk is how I got my first job in the government. So one of the students reminded me. There's a moral there about networking. Okay, so I know we have a diverse crowd, so I'm just going to start with some basic definitions so we're all on the same page. I think loosely everybody knows what an economist is, but just a standard definition here. An economist is a professional and practitioner in the social science discipline of economics. The individual may also study, develop, and this part's important, apply theories and concepts from economics and write about economic policy. Okay? A consultant, this is just a definition from Harvard Business School, is someone who advises on how to modify is going to be important, modify, proceed in, or streamline a given process within a specialized field. Okay, so this is about as mathematical as this talk will get. This equation so don't be afraid. So what do you get when you combine the two? Well, you get a consultant economist, which is, in my opinion, someone who acts in the capacity of a consultant. So that consultant framework, that third party, ideally unbiased advice, okay? But someone who uses tools from an economic toolkit, okay? Now, there are three tools I use frequently in my work, okay? The first, we call it first and second order effects, okay? So you may be in a situation where this could either be in the corporate world, there's a change in the corporate bylaws, it could be in public policy, there's a change in expenditure or tax policy, okay? A first order effect is that initial impact, what we predict will be the impact, okay? A second order effect is the impact of the impact, okay? And oftentimes in policy evaluation, people tend to ignore second order effects, or they don't evaluate them properly, and then they get the wrong cumulative or net effect, okay? So this is something that I use a lot, okay? The second is what we call the counterfactual, okay? So if anybody here is a science fiction fan, you can think of this as a parallel universe. So what happens is, you reach a point, we call it a decision node, okay? That node branches off into different decisions, okay? And if I pick one path, the counterfactual says, what would have happened in the absence of that choice? It sets up this hypothetical benchmark, okay? So for example, if you think about some humanitarian project, I know some of the students said they want to work for the UN or whatnot, we may be evaluating some sort of effectiveness of some food or medicine delivery program, okay? But then we have to think, what is the counterfactual? It may be a different program. It may not be nothing at all, it may be a different program. So that becomes the benchmark we're measuring against, okay? So this is a tool that I frequently use. The third third tool, which is very important, is this quantification, what I call an apples-to-apples comparison. Okay? So I'll give you an example. This happens a lot in public infrastructure projects. Okay? Maybe we want to expand a roadway. Okay? The costs are fairly certain. I can know with a high degree of accuracy, my material costs, my labor costs, etc. Okay? But the benefits by default are not in a monetary unit. So the benefit might be time saved. So now I'm stuck with this apples to oranges comparison, which I can't do much with. So I need to make it an apples to apples comparison. So a lot of my work deals with techniques on how do I take that non-monetary amount and bring it to a monetary amount, so I can have that consistent comparison. Okay? So if we expand a roadway and the cost is say $10 million, and everybody on the road saves 15 minutes on their commute, I have to put that into a dollar amount to compare consistently. Now, if you've taken your quantitative classes, it's very rare you get a point estimate. You actually get confidence interval, lower bound, upper bound. Okay? But in either case, if you pass it on both sides, then you're good. Okay? So this is an important tool, because by default, a lot of the projects you evaluate aren't always in dollar amounts. Part of it may be, but if you're thinking about, let's say, lives saved, or you think about something like health, pain reduction, these are not by default monetary units. Okay? So in order to do effective evaluation, you need that apples-to-apples comparison. Okay? And there's some very sophisticated literature on how to do this, but there's also a practitioner handbook. It's used by the World Bank, for example. They had a series of policy notes on it. Okay? But it's very important in economic consulting and policy evaluation. Okay. Now, this is important because you need to think about where you can add maximum value and under what conditions can you add maximum value. Okay? So consultants, by default, usually you don't see many of them. Okay? So there's certain circumstances where they fit really well into a situation. So here are some criteria. Okay? The first is an organization lacks the internal expertise required. So there's some sort of niche or specialty skill. Okay? If you're dealing with medium-sized businesses, this is often where it happens, where small businesses don't have the budget for consultants, and big businesses, they have enough expertise, they often don't need it. But medium-sized businesses tend to need it. And they may have somebody who is an accountant or who's a business manager, but they may need somebody to evaluate a particular program. Maybe they're doing a charitable drive, or it could be a for-profit program. Okay, but they may not have that internal project evaluation expertise. Okay. Now these are and/or. Okay, these conditions. Okay. This one's really important. The second one. Sometimes you need a third-party, unbiased, and unencumbered view. Okay. Now that might seem a bit of a tautology, but there's actually a distinction. Okay. This basically boils down to being able to speak truth to power. You may have somebody in an organization whose view might be encumbered, maybe they want a particular promotion or whatever the case may be. Okay? So consultants can add a lot of value in this case, where they're not in the internal mechanisms of the employee structure and whatnot. Okay? So they can speak freely. Okay? You may have a situation where a decision maker is stuck, but believes a solution yet unknown to them could exist. We call these known unknowns. Okay? So this could be in a policy situation. Maybe I'm aware of another department in another country that successfully did a particular program, but I just don't know how to do it. And this ties into the next point. How do I operationalize it? I might have the goal, I might have the vision, but what are those practical steps? What are those intermediary steps? How do I go from goal to realization? That operational aspect is very important because consultants, ideally with their experience, have seen a range of projects. Okay, so they understand how to implement, okay, because they've worked on so many projects. Okay, whereas individual businesses and policymakers might be somewhat siloed. Okay, to some extent, there are things like conferences that help disseminate knowledge, but oftentimes it's not a complete fix for the problem. Okay. Okay. Now, there's going to see a couple of themes here. So there's 4 mini cases I'll tell you about. And you're going to notice 2 themes throughout these projects. One is the importance of a novel or fresh set of eyes approach to an unsolved problem. you've probably seen this in your own time as a student. Maybe you've written an essay, and you know what, you leave it for a few hours, you come back and like, wow, did I ever miss the mark, right? Or you give it to a friend, and they say, maybe you want to retweak this, right? So that fresh set of eyes has really happened. I mean, to paraphrase Albert Einstein, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, it's insanity. Maybe the psychologists can, right? So it's the same thing here, right? So consultants, they approach problems without that siloed view of being in that organization, okay? And that's really important. The second, in today's world, everything is about evidence-based decisions. Nobody wants to make a big decision without evidence to back it up, okay? No minister wants to sign off on some huge expenditure, or no CEO, okay? You need evidence. It's just a type of liability management. That doesn't always mean you get perfect evidence. Sometimes you have to make a value judgment, but you start with evidence and you understand the limitations. If you've taken your quantitative classes, you have what's called out-of-scope forecast, and things like that, okay? So you have to understand the limitations of this, when does this work, under what conditions does it work, but you start with evidence-based decisions. A generation ago, there was this, shoot from the hip mentality in the business world, but today, shareholders or, in the public sector, ministers, they want evidence. So recently they were talking about building this rail link, possibly high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal. And it takes years of studies, environmental studies, economic studies, right? Because if you're going to sign off on like a multi-billion-dollar project, you want to make sure that you have some evidence to back it up. And one of the things we talked about at lunch was we came up with that old saying, some of you told me, failure to plan is planning to fail, right? So you have to start with that plan. And you make your plan dynamic. You update it as new information comes in, okay? But you start with that plan, okay? Okay, so here's some real-world cases. Okay, so this is a project that I've been intimately involved with. And here's what we call initial conditions. Okay, so since the 1970s, Canada has had very liberal immigration policies, and a lot of immigrants have settled in the GTA. And there's a significant number of immigrants who would self-identify as members of the Muslim faith or Islamic faith. Okay, now the problem is a lot of these members don't really feel comfortable with the conventional banking system. Okay. So the conventional banking system is interest-based. If I put my money in the bank, they pay me a little bit of interest, very, very little, right? And if I borrow, they charge me a lot. Okay, we call this the interest rate spread. A lot of modern financial institutions are based around this concept of interest rate spread or margin. Okay, Islamic finance prohibits what we call interest, or the classic word is usury. Okay, interesting side note: this is not unique to Islam. If you go back to some earlier forms of Judeo-Christian, there's some of the same prohibitions, okay? What they advocate is what we call profit loss sharing, okay? Now, the problem is we have the situation, we have a sizable population that doesn't want to fully engage with the banking system. So this is the problem, okay? It's not good for anybody, it's not good for them, it's not good for the economic system. So I was asked to be the lead consultant and try to figure out a way, can we fix this, okay? So the first thing, and this is something for the students, when you're doing what we call a feasibility study, you're trying to plan something, you first need to know the rules of the game. You need to know the framework, okay? So in Canada, banks are regulated at the federal level, okay? And credit unions are regulated at the provincial level. And the regulatory threshold for a credit union is significantly less than a bank, okay? So it's seen as an easier point of entry, okay? But the first thing is you need to know the rules of the game. So we know the regulator is what's called FSRA, Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, okay? And that sets the framework that we need to work within, okay? So when we do a business case and a business plan, anybody know the difference actually between a business case and a business plan? Anybody want to guess? There's a subtle difference. Maybe Alan? Alan's one of my students.
I would say like a business case is like a scenario for the business itself, and a business plan is how you're going to like achieve.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so the business case is more abstract. It's just, here's the case, here's why it works on first principles. The business plan tries to operationalize that. It goes into the more granular details, okay? So the first step is we engage the regulator, and we say, here's what we want to do, here's the business case. They say, okay, yeah, a big population, this has been done in other countries, the business case looks solid. Now we need a business plan with the minute details, okay? So what FISRA is interested in, they want to make sure that first of all, there's a genuine demand for the service. Opening a new credit union isn't like opening a lemonade stand on your front lawn. It's also takes a lot of public resources. Taxpayer money backstops the system. Regulators oversee the system. Okay, so it's a very long vetting process. Okay, so the first thing is they want to see that a genuine demand exists. Okay, the second thing is there's a lot of technical regulations. I won't go too deep into it, but they want to see that the business plan can comply with those technical regulations. Okay? Okay, so how do we solve this problem? Well, since you're taking both quantitative and qualitative research, you can appreciate this. We use both. Okay? So we had a very robust study done, about 3,000 potential members. It's a long survey, almost 15 to 20 minutes, because you need a lot of detailed information about people's expected withdrawals and deposits and product usage, because you need to build a model, a financial model from this. So it's a very robust survey, a lot of survey data. And for those of you who have taken your quantitative class, you start with the most basic things. You check are there outliers, you check for data integrity, data consistency, okay? I tell my students, start right to finish right. If you get the first step wrong, if you have inconsistent data, data that's been collected inconsistently from your sources, you're in trouble. Right? It's like, trying to build a skyscraper on an unsteady foundation. Okay. So we had a lot of quantitative data, but we also had qualitative. So there were some politicians who wrote in letters of support, prominent business people who wrote in letters of support, and it's both quantitative and qualitative. So a lot of projects in the world, it's not one or the other. It's both. They work together. It's not quantitative at the absence of qualitative. It's part of the big picture. Okay. Now this helped us a lot. We basically have what's called proof of concept. So Islamic banking has been successfully integrated in the financial systems of fairly developed and sophisticated countries like the UK and Australia. So this made our job significantly easier because we said, look, proof of concept already exists. It works. Okay. Now we just need to fine tune it for the case of Ontario. So where are we at with this? Well, I can't say too much because of non-disclosure agreements, but we've had some high-level talks, and things are progressing quite well. And the next step would be, once there is approval, then you can formally sell membership shares to prospective members and incorporate. Okay? So that's where we are. Okay? Now, the next project, we're going to switch from banking to municipalities. Now, there's an important theme here. Okay, when you do project evaluation, you have to be careful not to cook the books, not to have a predisposed outcome. Okay, I tell students saying yes to a good project conceptually is just as good as saying no to a bad project. Okay, when you do the evaluation and you say, you know what, no, this is not going to work. Okay, if you can avoid a loss, it's like getting a gain. Okay, just conceptually. Okay, so this project, think small town Ontario. Think of a town, 50 to 100,000 people. Okay, and after the global financial crisis, this is in 2008. Did you guys know about the global financial crisis? Yeah. Okay. So there's something called counterparty risk. So if I'm a party to a transaction and you're the opposite, you're called a counterparty. And at the height of the global financial crisis, really big banks didn't trust each other. Things like Goldman Sachs and HSBC and whatnot. Okay, and banks became really risk adverse because for the first time in a long time, you had major banks start to fail. To kind of give you a medical analogy, I joke with some of my medical friends. It's like having a star athlete come into the doctor's office and have some sort of problem that's typically for people who are not in that category. Okay, so a lot of the banks became really risk adverse. And what happened was small towns felt it, okay? So if I'm a small business in this town, if I'm an antiquity store, if I'm a bookstore, if I'm a restaurant, even at the best of times, banks would probably be pretty onerous of me. They'd want personal collateral, mortgage my house, things like that, okay? But after the global financial crisis, it was even worse, okay? But a couple of town councilors said, our incentives are a little bit different than the bank, okay? So if I'm a bank and I've given you a loan, the best possible thing that can happen to me is they get the money back in full and on time, including interest. That's the best thing. Every other case is a lesser version of that. I either don't get the money back on time or in full, okay? But for the town, they get some extra benefits, okay, potentially. If a business starts to flourish, and that business attracts other people, what's going to happen is property values are going to go up. Property tax is going to go up, all right? That's a gain that would not accrue to a bank, but potentially to the town, okay? So the town said, let's explore this. We know our business is. If the banks don't want to lend, what if we lend? What we call a venture development corporation, okay? And this is the kind of stuff you do in policy evaluation. You evaluate these sort of things, okay? Now, of course, this gets somewhat complicated, but I'll try to give you the streamlined version, okay? So again, the first thing you need to do is you need to know the rules of the game. You need to know the legal framework, okay? So yeah, in any of these government departments, Department of Finance, you work with a lot of lawyers, right? Everything needs to be legally vetted. So the first thing we had to do in this project was get a legal opinion. So there's a prominent law firm who did a legal opinion. They said, let's look at the Municipalities Act, let's look at the Corporations Act. Long story short, they said, yes, the town could conceivably do this. There's some caveats. I won't get into the legalese of it, but there's some caveats. But in short, yes, they could do this. Now, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, okay? So in principle, the town could do this, okay? Now, what we had to do as consultants was to do this detailed business plan and say, you know, what's the expected return? How volatile is it? You know, how long will it take to get the money back? Put some meat onto the bones of this, okay? So we did that, okay? And ultimately, we ended up presenting to the town council, okay? And at the time, the council decided to basically defer a decision on that project. This was back in 2015, okay? And the reason is, in my opinion, what we call an intertemporal problem. This is a fancy way of saying between time periods, okay? So if I'm a politician today, the citizenry today is going to have to absorb the cost to set up this new corporation, the seed money. So the cost is going to be absorbed during my tenure in office, but the benefits are going to happen to someone else's tenure, right? So we call this an intertemporal problem, this problem between time periods, right? You know, no politician wants to announce new measures that's going to involve taxes and whatnot, okay? So there's a very interesting project, and what I want you to take away from this is this understanding the framework you have to work in, right? So you first have to understand the legal framework. Same with the previous example of Islamic banking. You have to work within these frameworks, okay? If you don't do that, you're going to be way off the mark to begin with, okay? So very, very important to do that. Okay. Case 3 is about a Caribbean financial institution. So this institution was called a building society. A building society is basically a large credit union. They mostly deal with savings and home loans, okay? This is different than a Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, which has sophisticated investment banking or whatnot, okay? Now, this institution was pretty big in the Caribbean, and they had offices in London, UK, Toronto, and Miami, and they try to tap into the Caribbean diaspora through those offices. Well, people want to build a house back on the beach kind of thing, okay? And this building society, they wanted to convert to a full-fledged investment bank because the type of products investment banks give have much thicker profit margins, okay? Now, it's not that easy to convert. It's a long regulatory process, okay? But the reason I got involved with this is because of my experience in the Department of Finance and the Financial Sector Policy Branch. And it relates to this old Chinese proverb, to know the road ahead, ask those who are travel it, or another version goes, who are returning from it, okay? So Canada, there's something called the International Financial Stability Board, and Canada played a leading role in that. And a lot of developing countries, they took the best practices in financial stability. So as someone who worked in the regulatory apparatus, I understood what needed to be done, okay? So that's how I got involved with this, okay? And in terms of what they had to do, well, they first have to get, there's a certain threshold of members that have to agree on a major change. It's in what's called their bylaws or articles of incorporation. Okay, so the members agreed, okay, we're going to do this. So members are converted into shareholders. Okay? And once that is done, this is done, in parallel. We have to convince the regulator, the central bank of this island economy, that this wouldn't affect the stability of the financial system on the island. Okay? So one of the things they worry about in the financial sector, this sort of a medical analogy, is what they call contagion. They don't want one institution to have a problem and it has a contagion effect on others. Okay? So on these small island economies, they're much more fragile. You might just have 2 or 3 decent-sized institutions. So they wanted to make sure that this conversion wouldn't create a whole bunch of new risk. Okay? So basically the result was that the conversion was successfully approved in 2018, and they did convert. Okay? But again, a couple of themes to go back. The importance of looking at a problem with a fresh set of eyes. Okay? So if I was only part of the executive of that bank, I'm sort of siloed. I'm not quite aware of some of the best practices that are going on. Okay? And that's where consultants can help. All right? And again, if I'm going to spend a lot of the members' money, I need to make sure that there's a plan. Right? That doesn't mean there's not the chance of loss, but you want to have the best plan possible. Okay? Now this one's closer to home. In Ontario, we have something called Bill 60. It's a new piece of legislation by the Ford government. And it's called the Integrated Community Health Services Act. Okay? And basically what this allows, in principle anyways, is the creation of these for-profit centers that would do services that were traditionally in government facilities, but people can still use their OHIP card to pay. Okay? So procedures that would have taken OR time can now be done in private facilities. Okay? The facility has to apply for a license. Okay? To give an example of this, you saw this during COVID. So you could get a COVID test paid for by the government under various conditions, if certain conditions were true, or you could pay for one yourself. If you're going on a trip somewhere and you're like, the heck with this, I'm just going to pay for it myself. Okay? So there's a group of orthopedic surgeons who approached my company and said, we want to apply for this license. Do we have can you come up with an approach and a plan? Okay? So the plan, it's a 3-step process. Okay? So remember, you have to first get the license. So even though the government said in principle you can do this, it doesn't just mean anyone can open a clinic. You have to get the license. Okay? So the plan is we have to quantify the public benefits and show there's a benefit beyond just private interest. It's a public benefit. Okay? So for example, if I can show that by creating this private clinic, I'm going to reduce the wait list for hip and knee replacement from 6 months to a year to 2 to 3 months, and I go one step further and say, here are the labor market outcomes of that. So the people who are on the wait list, maybe they switch from full-time work to part-time work. Maybe they've had to leave the labor force completely. Okay, if I'm able to, quantify that public benefit, okay, I can speed this up by getting the wait list down and get these people back to work, or even just alleviate pain. Okay, and there's ways you can quantify that. Okay, that's something that's going to interest the Ministry of Health. Okay, the Ministry of Health doesn't want to know you're going to set this up and going to make a lot of money. They want to understand from the public interest standpoint. Okay, this one is really important. There's something called a zero-sum game. Anybody know what a zero-sum game is? Maybe you heard about this. I'll pick on Alan because an economics student rhymes.
There's one winner and there's one loser.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I win, you lose, and vice versa.
Exactly. My gain offsets your loss. The example I often give relates to the stock price, right? If let's say I'm selling a share of Apple, right? Presumably I'm selling that share because I think it's at its maximum, it's going to go down. If you buy it, presumably you think it's going to go up. Only one of us can be right. It can't go simultaneously up and down, right? And my gain or my loss will offset yours. So one of the things the ministry is worried about is they don't want these private clinics to take away staff from the public. Okay, so they don't want the hospital to be short, specialized technicians and nurses. So the plan here is you pick general staff that there's a surplus of. So there might be some young nurses or technicians who want more hours. Okay, and you train them to become the specialty staff you need. And that way you're not being a draw on the public resources. So it's what we call a positive sum game. Okay. So for example, there's some specialty eye clinics that do this. So they'll take a nurse and they'll train that nurse or train that technician to get them to that specialty level, right? And they haven't offset anything from the public system. They haven't taken the technician from the OR. Okay. So these 2 points are really important. And then finally, again, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. So this is where you have to go back to the potential incorporators or founders and say, okay, if we can do this, does it still make sense for you, given your time, given your investment dollars, right? So if they're going to invest this out of the clinic, if they're going to work a shift on a weekend or an evening, okay, we then have to say the expected return and the risk around that return, is it acceptable to you, okay? So that's the approach that we take. Okay, so maybe you've heard this phrase, necessary and sufficient conditions, okay? So this is important in project evaluation, program evaluation, okay? Have you learned about scenario and sensitivity analysis in your research classes? They kind of good. Okay. So, the world is, there's an old joke. There's only 2 guarantees in life, death and taxes, right? So whenever you do these forecasts or projections, you do scenarios. So in a classic business case, you say, what if it's a recession? What if it's an economic boom? But there might be different scenarios that are applicable in other contexts. If you're doing a public health project, what if there's an epidemic? What if there's a reduction in, whatever the particular scenarios that are relevant in that context, okay? So scenarios is very important. There's something called sensitivity. You use it a lot in statistics. You just change only one parameter and you keep everything else constant. So there might be one parameter that you're really unsure about estimating, but you have a plausible range. So you can play around with that and say, what happens if I'm at the upper bound, the lower bound? Does the result still work out okay? Okay. So sensitivity and scenario is really important, and it goes back to, again, risk management. Okay. So this particular project is an active project. It's being worked on as we speak. We're at the data collection stage. Okay. So we've collected some, anything to do with healthcare, the data is long. You have to go through research ethic boards, and it takes a while to get data about patients. But we're at the data collection stage. Okay. Right. So, one thing I'd encourage you to do is to think about this less as a rigid formal lecture and more as a fireside chat. I think you'll get more benefit from that. So feel free to ask any questions or comments. I know Vicky had mentioned something about internships, so I'll tell you how I got my first job in the government. Okay, it's really, really important to put yourself out there at events. So I was a graduate student. I was at Carleton, and there was something called the Canadian Economics Association. And at the time, one of my professors was organizing the conference. It's a fancy downtown hotel, Chateau Laurier. And he had asked for grad students to help organize the conference. And nobody put up their hand, and I guess for whatever reason, call it luck, call it just feeling sorry for the guy, whatever the case may be, I volunteered to help organize, like sign in attendees and that kind of stuff, right? And because I helped organize the conference, they gave me a conference pass and had, like I said, when you're a grad student, go to every free lunch and dinner. And sure enough, one of the people I ended up sitting beside happened to be a manager in the Department of Finance. And I just chatted with her, and at the end we exchanged business cards. And I had about a year to go in my program. And just every couple months we kept in contact, just send an interesting article or a paper. And when I was coming close to graduation, she had mentioned to me, oh yeah, we have this university recruitment campaign, and I think you'd be a good fit for it and you should apply. And that makes a big difference, because whoever's on that interview panel, now it's not just this sort of faceless CV. It's somebody who they've had some interaction with. And if you think about it from the standpoint of a hiring manager, it's just risk management. Like you now have that more information about that person. You've been corresponding with them for a couple of months. You can tell if they have some aptitude, if they're asking sharp questions, okay? So there's an old saying, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So anytime you get these opportunities, just put yourself out there, have that elevator pitch that they call it, So really, really important, So maybe there's a conference coming up that Vicky might need your help with, I don't know, But yeah, feel free to ask any questions or comments. That's just one possible pathway, but yeah. Alan, yeah.
So in that case, with the private sector, do you think when you talk with them, there's like a political risk and all that's associated with like the change in governments of
right.
some kind?
That's certainly out there. Yeah, it's what we call regulatory risk, that there could be a change in regulation. Political risk is really hard to predict.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I mean, you look at what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, very few people can give you a concise end game. It's very, very hard to predict. So, this is part of the risk that's built in when you do the financial model. And you say to them, okay, are you okay with that risk? And it's something they have to think about. This is where scenarios come in, right? So you have a scenario where there's no change in the regulatory environment, a scenario where there might be some small tweaks, and you might have a scenario where there's, maybe a government that has the complete opposite view comes in and says we're going to shut it down, right? So you just have to build that in. My gut feeling, just from the interactions I've had with the medical practitioners, is they think this will be the way of the future, and the government's kind of walking a tightrope because they're trying to say, for profit, but you can still use your OHIP card. So they're trying to do both. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things that can make that regulatory risk more likely. If it turns out that people start complaining, I showed up at the hospital and there was a shortage of nurses, and we find out that the private clinic is full of nurses, that might increase the chance of a regulatory risk, right? So there's a couple of indicators you can pay attention to gauge the likeliness of that risk, right? But if the system's working pretty smooth, you can say that it's, probably you're okay. Yeah. Yes, Vicky.
I have two questions, but my
Sure.
first question is, I just read in the newspaper that the private clinics are actually getting paid more for the same procedures as the public clinics. It was just this week, I think.
Right.
It was,
Yeah, I read it.
yeah.
Was that looking at the exact article? I can kind of give a general comment. So with OHIP, there's a list of billing codes.
Right.
What probably happens is they're able to bill for several
Yeah,
things.
they used to.
So, they might pay an anesthesiologist this amount and then bill at this level. So they use the same codes, but probably the way they package them is a bit better. Yeah. That's my guess. Yeah.
Okay. My second question is about your initial assumption that consultants are unencumbered.
Right.
So, for example, London's a very small community psychologically,
Right.
and there's like a set of consultants who do a lot of the work,
Right.
and you kind of know that you have to tell the
Yeah.
city or whoever you're working for what they want to hear, or they're not going to rehire you.
This can happen sometimes. Or what some consultants try to do is set themselves up for future work. And I leave it a bit of a
Yeah, that too.
right. Sometimes you have to deal with these imperfect situations. Life kind of gives hard choices. But the best case is if you have a client who really wants to find the truth, wants to find the correct answer, hopefully they'll appreciate that unencumbered view. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you walk in and you're a bit constrained. I've been in those situations, and what I would say is that sometimes there's insiders and there's outsiders, and sometimes it's better to be on that inner circle, even with those constraints. You can kind of nudge in the right direction, as opposed to just saying, "I'm not going to do this project. I don't like how it's done," and have no influence. At least if you're in that inner circle, even if you're kind of being pulled in certain ways, you might have a little bit more influence to push it the other way.
So have you turned down projects?
Yeah, there's been some projects where we, myself and sometimes other consultants form a syndicate or consortium, and we would say, yeah, we don't want to work with those people again just because, we know how they're going to kind of spin this in a different direction that we don't want to go. And this is the problem. When decision makers and policymakers have a feasibility study or have a program they want to evaluate, they're almost already tied to the outcome to some extent, right? It's really hard for them to step back emotionally and say, you know what, maybe that program isn't that good. It's hard. I mean, if you're a town councilor and you dreamt up this plan about this venture development corporation, you get really, really excited, it's going to be really hard for you to look at it objectively and say, maybe it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. It does happen, and I think, like I said, in those situations, there's one of two things. Sometimes it's better to be on the inside and you can kind of nudge, or you just have to realize, yeah, I can't work with this group. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question about accountability of consultants.
Accountability. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, what if the one who hired you followed your recommendation?
Right.
And then it turned out.
I know where you're going with this.
What is this?
Okay, so
It's your
right.
responsibility.
So a couple of things. The first is you have really good contracts. You have long contracts.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch of clauses in the contracts. There's a Latin phrase. I can't remember it right now, but it basically says if something major happens, like for example when COVID happened, that frustrated a lot of business contracts. Okay. So the first is you really want to define the scope carefully. Define your scope of work carefully. Sometimes there's scope creep. You have to be careful of that. Just say, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. And when you make recommendations, you want to qualify everything you say. So something I tell students is just because this is a good answer, it doesn't mean in an absolute sense. It might be a good recommendation if A, B, and C hold, right? So if I do a study and I tell a company expanding to Europe, I don't want to say it like that. I want to say, okay, look, do a pilot project. If you get these results from the pilot project, then do these steps. So good contracts and qualify all your recommendations. Because in today's world, the old saying about how failure is an orphan. Like, so if a project fails, they're going to want to find everybody to blame, right? Luckily, it's never been a problem for me. I found in my experience, if you start with a really professional contract, that tends to send a signal. So in economics, there's something called signals and screens, and everything you do sends signals. So a consultant who does that sends a really prominent signal that I know how it works. I'm looking out both for you and for me. And then, like I said, just qualify your recommendations. Maybe some of the students.
No, I was just going to say, were you talking about the force majeure clause?
Oh, force majeure, yeah. Force majeure. Yes, that's what it's. Yes, that's if something completely unexpected and earth-shattering happens.
It's not your responsibility.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
With the private clinics and the thing about zero-sum with nurses, instead of taking away from the nurses, find the nurses that want to enhance their skill. I was wondering just why you would go the route of enhancing the amount of nurses there are, because there's a shortage across the board. So I don't see the current nurses volunteering to learn a new skill.
Well, so this is So if I'm a private clinic, I can't control the pipeline of nurses coming out. Right? That's the nursing school. That's the province. What I can do is maybe there's a college graduate with a nursing degree versus a university degree, and maybe I can train and bridge that gap. Right? That's what I can do. That's kind of how they approach it.
Because I just hear it all the time. Nurses are put in ER rooms and going to put Botox in people's faces. The less working hours and it's a little more glamorous.
They get paid more.
Yeah,
So that's where I kind of see the zero-sum thing.
Yeah. No, exactly. But when this goes to the Ministry of Health, they don't want to feel like you're pulling resources from the public system. So it can't be zero sum. It has to be what we call positive sum. You grow the pie rather than redistribute it. Yes, Alan.
So what would you say, like you started with your sort of toolkit that you're using, right?
Yes.
And when you're working on these cases, is there some tools that you're using more so than others, or is there like a step-by-step process that you undertake with each of these things, or is it sort of contingent?
It really depends on the project, but in general, like I said, you always start by understanding the rules of the game. What are the particular regulations you need to fit within? Whether it's federal, provincial, municipal. Okay, so you first have to understand the rules of the game before you play the game. So that's the first step. Okay, then depending on what the project is, you look at data sources, availability of data. There's not really like a boilerplate approach.
Yeah.
It depends on the project, but those are some basic steps.
I was just going to ask about how you got into economic consulting, and if you have any advice for
good
anyone who would like to get
So
into it.
typically when you've been on the regulatory side of government, consulting becomes a natural extension. So it's like someone who works in the Food and Drug Administration. They go to the pharmaceutical companies. right? So I guess it was just, that's just the way the career naturally evolved, that when you've been on the regulatory side, compliance, advising, and consulting becomes a natural step. And then a lot of consulting projects, aren't advertised. I mean, some of the really big ones is what's called an RFP, request for proposal. Those are advertised. But a lot of the other ones are just, like I said, you know the decision maker, you understand the problem, you make a sales pitch, and you go with it. Government consultant is an entirely different kettle of fish. It's all about RFPs and how to write good RFPs, and that's like a body of knowledge on its own. And even then, sometimes you have what's called preferred vendors, and there's all different lists to get on, and but the vast majority of consulting work I've done is mostly informal. So like I said, this is why it's important to get involved. Get involved in your community. Like I give an example. For a long time, I was involved with the Rotary Club. I didn't do it to necessarily lead to consulting work, but you meet people, and they learn about what you do, and and then sometimes just you connect two and two. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure,
too.
please. Yeah.
I have three, but I
Sure.
start with one.
Sure.
So you evaluate projects.
Yes.
Do you have any strategies to evaluate your own work?
So we do have, so I work with a group of people. So there's a primary contractor and subcontractors. So we do have this internal validity. We do double check our work, especially for quantitative work. I have some friends who have PhDs in econometrics, so I'll ask them, can you just double check this? Is this the right test? Is this, there is a lawyer who I regularly subcontract to. So yeah, internal validity is important, because in consulting, it's very much a reputation game. There's no saying, a good reputation takes a long time to get and little time to lose. So you really want to make sure there's that internal validity, and that when you present something, it's good. Yeah.
Can I go over my second
Sure.
one?
Yeah.
Okay, so so one of the phases that I'm really interested in is when you said sometimes organizations don't know. Sometimes they know what they don't know, and sometimes they don't know what they want.
Yeah, we call it the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknown.
Perfect. There is all the puzzles, right?
Yes.
So I see a little bit of power dynamics there, right? Because the consultants can say, "Oh, this is the right things to do," because I already have it, and I know that I will bill 100 hours. I will do in 10.
Yeah.
So how you manage those kind of power dynamics, or attempt to manipulate or to be manipulated, because it's both
Yeah.
right?
I think a lot of it depends on how you got into that consulting project. So if it was informal, if you were recommended to the decision makers or makers, and there's already a good relationship to start, it's less adversarial.
All right.
If you've come about it maybe through a really rigorous RFP process, there might be some adversarial component to it, but it really depends, I think, on how you got the project to begin with. So like a lot of the projects I've done that have come about, just through mutual contacts or reputation, they're usually it's much more friendly. It's more like we call a gentleman's agreement. You work together, and it's less adversarial. But I can envision situations where there might be that. If, like I said, if it's someone in a minister or assistant deputy minister, and they have a budget and they have a timeline, and maybe they're getting pulled from above to see something go in this direction, then I can see that. And then it comes back to that decision node. Do you think it's better to be inside or outside, or is it just not for you? Yeah. Yes, Vicky.
Can you tell us a bit about the time frames for these projects?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, you mean like the length to? Okay.
Yeah.
It can vary. So on the short end, maybe 3 to 4 months. On the long end, maybe 2 years.
So for these ones?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Like
So yeah, I'll give you an example. Sure. So this is a really big project. This has been going on for the past year and a half. But it's not necessarily consistent over a year and a half. There's a lot of waiting. You submit stuff to the regulator, they get back to you, you're waiting for data to come in. So it's peak times. what you really want to do as a consultant, you have multiple projects, you really want to hope you can not have the peak times coincide.
And what usually happens.
It doesn't always work that way because every client thinks that their project is mission critical, but hopefully you can there's something called a Gantt chart. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about it, but you try to plan it in such a way that they don't overlap too much. So this project, when it's finished, this probably could be 3 to 4 years. This project was about 6 months. This was about between 6 months and a year. This one I expect will take about a year. But again, there's peak times. Yeah.
And just maybe to add on to that, is that part of the conversation, that initial conversation with these clients? You're saying like, well, based on what you told me, this is what I'm kind of envisioning.
Yeah. So when you do that contract, you have deliverables. So typically, there's a lot of interim deliverables, interim report, meetings with clients. So it's not just start and then finish. There's a lot of interim deliverables, and typically you get paid in certain tranches or phases. So this gets completed. Yeah. Sure.
Just one more.
Yeah, sure.
Because I've heard from different sort of sources, right? And maybe with like BCG or these bigger consulting firms and stuff like that. It seems like a lot of times they're getting hired by companies to sort of almost as like a way like, oh, we didn't, when we laid off 20% of the staff, it wasn't us, it was BCG, it was these other consulting firms. So do you find that at all?
Sometimes if there's something hard to be said, you want it to come from the consultants and not, it does happen. Recently in Canada, the federal government has been in a little bit of hot water, about things like ArriveCan and, sort of hired consultants who hire consultants, right? So, it can happen that probably for the next little bit, it's going to be a bit of a tricky framework to consult with the federal government because of, it's like one person kind of ruins it for everybody else kind of thing. But yeah, if there's something hard to be said, typically you kind of want the consultants to say it and say,
And so, I mean, when you do that, then is it, like, how do you deliver, like, you're delivering that news to the board of directors?
Yeah, so, I mean, you would just, it might be the viability for a particular business unit, and you might just say, these are the macro trends, this marketplace is shrinking, it's, and then the decision maker just says, look, I didn't make this decision, this is the objective results, and, it is what it is.
I'm struggling with it is what it is because I always try to find a different scenario possible, or I totally agree with you, but I just struggle with the idea to finish something like, oh, it is what it is, because sometimes it seems really an excuse just to reorganize, right?
I mean, there are some decision makers who will pass off the hard things to consultants, right? I mean, but there are decision makers who will, show good leadership in situations like that and work with the employees, But there are other times consultants do reports. It happens in the public sector all the time. Consultants do reports and just sits on some shelf in Queen's Park, for years, right? Yes.
So as an outsider, sometimes as a consultant you are an outsider. So how do you bridge that gap of being able to make connections with the team you're working with, but also have that unencumbered view?
It's hard. I think you want to set the stage from day one. So I think the whole saying, friendly but not friends, probably sums it up. Because if there's a group of people, and if they think that you're too close to one set of decision makers, you're going to start to become, they might view you as biased. And then you might not get the information you need from them, or the right data, or the right views. So friendly but not friends, I think is how you do it.
And I guess maybe just to add on to that, like, say you get hired on, they're considering, the CEO or whoever is very adamant about this project that they want to take, and then you come in and you're like, this doesn't look like it's going to pan out. I mean, do you deliver, like, how do you go about delivering sort of that news to
again, I think, if you can avoid a loss, right, that's conceptually just as good as getting engaged, right? So, you pitch to them that way and say, maybe in the boardroom this looks good, or maybe at the minister's office this looks good, but on the front lines when you try to operationalize it, there's just a lot of things that have to go right, and it's very low probability. And I think the other thing, he explains to people is that sometimes there aren't always perfect solutions. In economics, we call it theory of the second best. Sometimes you have to pick an imperfect solution, and that's how it is. But one thing I was telling the students, government is a good place to be to start your career, especially because government hiring is not really related to the business cycle. So if there's a recession, if there's, they tend to have a pretty steady flow. So it's a good place to be in that regards. I've been out of the government game for a while. I do have a friend at the Bank of Canada who's on the recruitment panel. I don't necessarily know. I know they hire research assistants. I can ask him, about this program.
Mikhail's the internship
Okay,
coordinator.
I'll connect you with him. His name's Bradley Howell. Yeah, he's on the university recruitment panel. And a lot of these places, they don't always want technical people. They need people to write memos and reports and knowledge mobilization. Take a technical topic, put it in a non-technical way, right? So, yeah. Okay.
That's great.
All right. Well, hopefully that helped you guys.
Yes, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you very much.